there is a huge spiritual dimension of building the land of Israel, building companies, building the future. And I dare say that creating technologies that will solve pollution, that will help with the energy crisis, that will feed the planet, that will solve healthcare, that will make children learn better. All of this is God's work. We've got to create. We have to be partners with Hashem. We are partners in terms of building this wonderful, beautiful planet. And to not do so is I think, to turn your back on our tradition. Do have this sort of nasty disease, ALS, but I'm not letting it define me. And I'm actually opening up all kinds of new projects, which I'm working on. And literally, I flatlined at the hospital and was resuscitated and brought back after 8 minutes. So I think anyone would ask themselves after an event like that, okay, you've been brought back. What does that mean?
Shalom Aleichem, and welcome to Shark Tank. Shark Tank is a podcast about the challenges and opportunities of being a Ben Torah in the workforce. This week, we're joined by Jon Medved. Jon is the founder of OurCrowd. He's also one of the founding fathers of the Israeli startup nation scene. So, Jon, thank you for joining us and welcome.
It's great to be here, Yaakov. Thanks for having me.
So let's start with a little bit of sort of personal background. What was your childhood like? Entrepreneurship, investment, building companies, something that talked to you from a young age. What was the world that you inhabited in growing up?
Well, I was born in San Diego and raised in Los Angeles, out on the west coast of California, where there was a lot of sun, but at least in the years that I grew up in the 50s and 60s, not a lot of Yiddishkeit. And I literally grew up on the beach, both in Pacific Beach, San Diego, and Pacific Palisades, and spent a lot of time on boogie boards. And I was deeply into the 60s and changing the world, but grew up in a pretty warm Jewish family where we were considered fanatics for our neighborhood, which had a lot of Jews, but not a lot of Jewish observance. We had a Passover Seder, Pesach Seder, I would call it today, back then Passover, which usually had 60 or 70 or 80 people, potluck. And we were a warm Jewish family, but I was expelled from Hebrew school. I hated that. I didn't hate the fact that I was expelled. I thought maybe I'd be off the hook, but it just forced us to drive farther to shul. We lived about 20 miles from our conservative synagogue, which we didn't drive to except for the holidays. But what really got me into entrepreneurship was both my family's interest and love of politics and history, as well as the fact that my father, Alev Shalom David Medved, was a PhD in physics, who was a serial entrepreneur. And he built a very early startup as a chief scientist, which was bought by Xerox, and then built a fiber optic communications company. And believe it or not, that's how I started in entrepreneurship, was with an old Jewish tradition called nepotism.
Got it. And so you started out very far from Israel. You started out very far, geographically, spiritually far from what we would call, Orthodox Torah mitzvot observance, which you have a part of your life today. So could you take us briefly through that journey from, the Jon of the childhood out in the West Coast to the Jon in Yerushalayim today?
Well, first of all, I went to Berkeley because it was a political place and a really interesting place. And I got there sort of in the highlight of the 60s and early 70s. And I showed up, and I remember that I promised my parents, since I wasn't going to come back for the high holidays, that I would find a place to go to synagogue. And some of my friends said, hey, we'll go to Hillel, where there was a very reformed service. I had another friend said, no, let's go to this place called Chabad. where they drink. And I said, that sounds good. Let's go there. And it was the first experience I really ever had with Orthodox Yiddishkeit, and was very warm and accepting. And moreover, what really got me going was on the campus, there was a lot of Jewish activity with a group called the Radical Jewish Union. And in particular, when I went off to Israel after my freshman year, because that was the only place my parents would pay for a plane ticket, everybody I knew was going abroad somewhere. And I said, hey, how about Mexico or Spain or Morocco? And they looked at me like I was crazy. And they said, the only place we'll pay for is Israel. So I said, okay, Israel it is. And I went there, and I came back about a week before the war broke out in 1970, the Yom Kippur War. And that blew my mind, because what I had loved in Israel was the upbeat, wonderful feeling of making history. It deeply affected me on that trip. But then I saw that it was struggling for survival, and I felt like I was needed. And on the Berkeley campus, there was like a war breaking out. It was about 50 years early, where anti-Zionists and anti-Semites were fighting for literally under the headline of death to the Jewish state. And that really got me going. So ultimately, I became a Zionist activist on the campus, built Jewish organizations, worked for the Jewish Agency, would you believe, as a itinerant field worker, and then made Aliyah 1980 and came to Israel for the first time to live after many times visiting. But I got here to Israel. I wasn't observant. I was quite committed Jewishly. And I found my way into entrepreneurship, which is a whole other story.
So at what point would you consider yourself as becoming, shomer Torah mitzvos? What was that moment?
Well, what happened is, when I got to Israel as an Oleh Hadash, I joined my father with his fiber optic communication company called Merit. And I built a chapter in Israel, or a subsidiary. And he had no investment money. And this was the 1980s, where there was not a single dollar of investment dollars in Israel. So what I ended up doing is raising money from a company called ECI Telecom. And as soon as I raised the money, I had just got married to my wonderful wife, Jane, the mother of my 4 children and the grandmother of our 16 grandchildren. And the company that invested in our company said, look, you got to go back to the States. I said, what? I just made Aliyah. And they said, no, you got to go back, help your dad. He needs your ability to help build the business. And then you'll come back here in a year and everything will be fine. Well, we went to the States. It wasn't a year, it was 6 years. We ended up having 3 of our 4 children there. But there, my family had become active in a Baal Tshuva shul on the beach called essentially the Pacific Jewish Center, which was right on the boardwalk in Venice. And it was an incredible place. With my brother was the president, Michael Medved, and our rabbi was Rabbi Daniel Lapin. And we ended up falling in with the community. And that's what really changed a level of observance. So by the time I got back to Israel in 1991, after having made a successful exit with the fiber optics company by selling it to a big oil company called Amoco, which is today British Petroleum, we came back to Israel with 3 kids. We were religious, and we haven't looked back.
Wow. So it's really wild to hear how your journey professionally, religiously, nationally, all sort of intertwined and weaving and backs and forth. It's very interesting to hear that. So, many people are familiar with the book Startup Nation, or it started as a book by Dan Senor and Saul Singer. And so it's become sort of a brand that Israel is a leader in technology and innovation. So you played a role in that book, particularly, but just broadly in the, the early stages of Israeli tech. At what point did you realize that Israeli tech was punching well above its weight, and that should be part of our sort of global story?
Well, again, in the 80s, when I started the fiber optic company, I fell in love with these tech guys. And the way I did was I actually accompanied my father in 1982 on a visit to meet with some research guys over at Raphael, the guys who today make the Iron Dome as well as so much else, makes us safe, among other things. And I sat with them. I didn't really understand any of what they were talking about because I'd studied history, not engineering or physics. But at the end of the conversation, where I had driven my father up to north of Haifa from Jerusalem, they turned to me and they said, "Well, young Medved, what are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm, teaching Zionism. I'm working with summer students who come here, helping out with the Zionist movement." And they looked at me and said, "Wait, Ata Askan? You're just a bureaucrat?" And I said, no, I'm very committed. They said, "Look, you don't get it. Your father is an entrepreneur. He's a pioneer in fiber optics. That's the real Zionism today. If you want to do something for the country, go build a subsidiary and build a factory and get involved with this technology." And literally on the way home in the car, I asked my father, "Really, what is it that you're doing?" And at the end of that very, very faithful week visit, he decided to give me $100 a month to keep an eye on these guys and maybe see what I could do. And I fell in love with technology, and the rest is history. And that's really when I began to realize that Israel had this incredible potential being expressed, but no one really knew it. And what I could do with my English and sort of connections is help to tell that story more effectively.
I think I heard somewhere, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you at one point had like assembled a PowerPoint that you were giving in different places, and that PowerPoint was sort of the kernel that ended up being Dan Senor's book, Startup Nation. Is that true?
Look, I know Dan and Saul a long time. They are brilliant. What they've done for Israel is incredible. Yes, I gave that PowerPoint presentation to a group that Dan brought to Israel from Harvard. Saul was, I think, my analyst at Israel Seed when we were still in the basement phrase together with Michael Eisenberg and Neil Cohen. So I love those guys. They really did a huge thing for Israel in terms of crystallizing what was obvious to people like me and others and putting it into a book and launching really the brand of Startup Nation.
There's something that I've thought about a lot, and I think you'd be a great person to weigh in on this. You know, we're here in Strata Omer, we're counting towards, Shavuot and Ma'amad Har Sinai. And, it seems pretty clear to me that HaKadosh Baruch Hu didn't, choose the Jewish people at Har Sinai in order to be the home for NVIDIA's next R&D center. It's great. It's important for our economy and for our development and our world standing. But, from that angle, it's a means unto other ends, and not a inherently spiritual, valuable process. It's wonderful, but not like the core of what we're all about as a nation. Am I thinking about this wrong? Would you say it differently? Is there more spiritual and religious value in our framework, in the way you see it, Israeli startup scene, and our role as a nation among the world?
Absolutely. Look, I believe very strongly as a religious person between the connection of Yerushalayim Shulamata and Yerushalayim Shulamala. You can't separate them. Ein Kemach, Ein Torah. Okay? And the fact is that we need to have a robust economy so that people can live good lives and have time for Torah. And yet, look, there's nothing in our tradition that loves or embraces poverty. And the notion that Israel should be a nation of poor people, essentially subsisting on the halukah. That died hundreds of years ago. We are not going to survive on the devot. We always ask for it in all of our prayers. Parnasah, not tzedakah. We learn, in fact, that the greatest form of tzedakah from the Rambam is the fact that you teach somebody a skill so they can get a job. And therefore, there is a huge spiritual dimension of building the land of Israel, building companies, building the future. And I dare say that creating technologies that will solve pollution, that will help with the energy crisis, that will feed the planet, that will solve healthcare, that will make children learn better. All of this is God's work. And it's clearly got a spiritual element. My father wrote a book called Hidden Light about the Torah and science. And his premise, and I believe in it fully, is there is no contradiction between having a Torah outlook and a scientific outlook. Okay, I'm a believer in what's going on at Machon Lev, which is such a Kiddush Hashem, where you have the cutting edge of science and technology together with very, very solid Torah learning and Torah principles. And the notion that you have to separate these two is wrong, completely wrong. In fact, it's not just a modern phenomenon. If you look at the Avot, they were all entrepreneurs. Abraham was kaved betzon. Abraham amassed wealth. He was an evangelist. He spread the good news about Hashem. Okay, his son, Yitzhak, was an incredible hydrologist. He built wells. He was the water mikorot expert of his time. Yaakov Avinu was a biotechnologist. Look what he did with his son and creating proper breeding. And his son, Yosef, was the mashbir, was the public-private partnership, a great leader, economic and political. There is no reason to believe that these two things have to be separated. They are in our DNA. If Israel was not the startup nation, if Israel was not the light unto the nations, with this incredible besorah of NVIDIA. NVIDIA is not a small thing. NVIDIA is the most valuable company in the world and the most valuable company at the heart of the most important revolution of AI, chooses to build its most important research center in Israel. That's something that not just Israel and Jews worldwide should be proud of, but every religious person should be proud of this, because this is fulfillment of prophecy.
So that's really fascinating, and I'm really blown away by that response. And you actually lumped in a few different religious values that I wanted to maybe just point out in that answer, and then maybe put them together in a sense. You said ein kamach ein Torah, that each individual in the nation needs sustenance and shouldn't be poor. That's sort of one aspect. Number two, you mentioned Yishuv Haaretz, the fact that we are commanded to build up this country, and the Startup Nation is one of the primary vehicles that we've been doing to build up this country and make it as strong and powerful. And then the third thing is that some of the technologies, maybe not all of them, are helping to solve some of the world's problems, tikkun olam, creating solutions to various thorny issues around the globe by use of technology. But maybe putting them together, listening to you describe so eloquently these three things, the fact that and this is what Startup Nation is all about, such a small, besieged country with no natural resources is able to become a world leader through this thing. Is that also part of our sort of historical destiny to be such a great nation, despite physical specs that are so underwhelming? And the Startup Nation is also sort of putting these things together and creating a somewhat of a world power, a small power, well beyond what we should. Is that also sort of part of the historical arc, the way you see it?
Of course it is. I mean, look, why do you believe that about 40% of the Nobel Prizes in the sciences are in Jewish hands? Is that an accident? Do you know what that means? We are 0.2% of the world population, 0.2. And yet we have 40% of the Nobel Prizes in the sciences, a ridiculous percentage of billionaires. So much in the entrepreneurship or big companies were built by Jews that are changing the world for the better. So much in charity, in the building of hospitals, in the building of schools and universities. This is because that's what Jews do. And we don't do enough, both talking about Israel, but about Jewish greatness, about that Jews have to create. We learned that the world was not perfect in 6 days. We have what to do. The malacha is still to be done. We have work to do. We have to learn. We have to study our sources, but we've got to create. We have to be partners with Hashem. We are partners in terms of building this wonderful, beautiful planet. And I dare say planets beyond. That's what we have to do. And to not do so is I think, to turn your back on our tradition. Our tradition is about creation and about innovation. Our whole lives have been about innovating, but not rootless innovation, where we are informed by our past, where we're enriched by being part of this long chain. And that when you're building a company here in Israel or elsewhere, as a Jew, as a proud Jew, you're connecting of all these hundreds and thousands of years going backwards, but now you're connecting to the future. And so when you ask me, what am I most proud of? I'm proud that I'm part of this chain. I'm proud that I have a family that I'm so proud of, my children and grandchildren, my wife. And I'm proud of the people who I've been able to enable with funding or teach how to build companies and how to create innovative technologies.
Wow. So, I mean, one of the reasons why, some people might be a little harder to convince that there's a direct line between Har Sinai and the Startup Nation, would be that if you think about the world of innovation, you could divide technology broadly into 3 buckets. There are technologies that are clearly making people's lives better. Mobilize, just one example. There were 1,000 people dying by car crashes per month, and now there are 300 because of a technology like Mobilize. That's bucket 1. Bucket 2, though, is the technology that allows this zoom to be slightly faster, slightly sharper. I don't know, maybe sort of values neutral technologies that are not clearly of great value. And then there's also the third bucket, which is technologies that are actually doing real harm or, causing people to waste time, get addicted to certain things. Think about, sports gambling apps just as a one example. So, people don't view the technology world necessarily as something that we should embrace or just view as our core religious identity, because the technology bag is so mixed between some technologies which are so amazing and so wonderful, but also some which are neutral and some which are destructive. So what would you respond to someone who's thinking that as you're describing?
Look, I think technology is like anything. You have to deal with it in moderation and carefully. I love wine. I like single malt scotch. But if you do too much, it's really bad. I think that exercise is really important. But if you are completely obsessed, that's too much. Okay, I think that there are so many things that are good about technology. And when I think about how people are using technology to be able to get access to Sfarim and to text, how people are getting shiurim online, how people are cluing into a shiva overseas. Okay, there is so much that you can use, but obviously you can abuse this stuff, and you have to avoid the abuse. We have a big responsibility to combine our ethics and our morality with technology so we don't abuse it. But to say, no, technology, let's go back and live the way we lived in Poland or the Ukraine or in Morocco 200 years ago, no, thank you. That's not going to work, and it's not smart, and it's not Jewish.
Yeah, people also tend to over romanticize what life was actually like back then. It's a lot worse than they want to admit. I want to transition to maybe one last section to this conversation, which is that you have recently transitioned out of the CEO role of OurCrowd, which you occupied for many years due to health challenges, which you've sort of been open about. So has that transition been hard for you to go from sort of a full speed ahead CEO to someone who's sort of taking a little more of a backseat, overseeing more strategic things in the company, but not day-to-day operations?
Look, I've been productive for most of my life. And I've still got a lot of life left. Do have this sort of nasty disease, ALS, but I'm not letting it define me. And while I can't work 14, 16, 18 hours a day like I used to, I'm still putting in a good 8 to 10 hours a day. And I'm actually opening up all kinds of new projects, which I'm working on. I'm still helping companies. I'm still very much a member of the board in OurCrowd and wishing it well and helping. But there is so much to do, not just for specific companies, but for Israel and for the technology scene here. Successful in bringing billions of dollars into this economy and being involved in the funding of hundreds of companies and providing literally thousands and thousands of jobs. But there's a lot to do. We have huge challenges in terms of our image abroad, in terms of people's ignorance about Israel or the Jewish people. We have to deal with this, and we have to make sure that we strengthen our infrastructure, and in particular, our social solidarity. We have to be united to face these challenges. We have to learn to stop arguing all the time and to love each other and to see the beauty in Am Yisrael in all of its aspects, because it is beautiful. And we are Hashem's people, and we have a great future.
Wow, that's really beautiful, and wishing you continued good health, and you should feel good and have strength to continue the important work that you're doing. Having this awful diagnosis of ALS, how is that? How has your sort of faith helped you? Have you learned anything new about faith that you didn't before that you'd want to impart onto your children, your grandchildren, based off of this new perspective on life that you now have?
Look, I was very sick when I went to the hospital about 8 months ago. And literally, I flatlined at the hospital and was resuscitated and brought back after 8 minutes. Thank God my boys were there, and they literally encouraged the doctors to keep trying, and they succeeded in bringing me back. So I think anyone would ask themselves after an event like that, okay, you've been brought back. What does that mean? And for me, it means that I'm not done. There's still what that I have to accomplish, and I'm very determined to do so. I still have a lot of work to do. We all do. And the one thing my father, blessed memory, his favorite joke, someone would ask, what would you like them to say at your hesped? You say, oh, that's an easy question. They should get up and yell, hey, he's moving. Okay. The idea is that you should always live. And as long as you're moving, as long as you're breathing, you have to be productive. My father worked literally until the week before he died at age 83. He fought a nasty disease, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, for 14 years and survived. And a couple of weeks before he died, we celebrated his second bar mitzvah at age 83, because we believe that Melech David at age 70 had a life. At age 83, you get celebrate a second bar mitzvah. And my father read from the Torah most magnificently. We had a big party about the week before he died. He died on Shushan Purim. And at that party, he was talking about his new startup. He had built many startups and he was already planning the biggest one. That's how I want to go. I want to continue to work, be productive, to help people, to meet the challenges which we have, and they are significant, and go out doing what I love, surrounded by my beautiful family and friends, and continue to be part of this marvelous people and nation.
That's beautiful. And this conversation has been filled with so many great, perspectives and advice for people who are sort of starting out in their careers. And I know you said you have a lot of work still to do, so we're going to let you, go do that in a few minutes. But maybe if I could ask, one more question, which is someone who's sort of starting out their career nowadays, what other sort of core piece of advice that we haven't touched on yet would you want them to sort of have at the front of their mind as they're embarking on their journey, whether it's, anywhere, but especially people who are in Israel starting their careers?
Don't be stuck in a specific role. Embrace reinvention. Realize that you have to continually re-educate yourself and change. That's the only constant, is change. Stay true to your principles. Stay true to the Torah. Stay true to your role in the Jewish people. But learn to absorb the fact the world changes constantly. And so today, if you're not embracing AI, if you're not learning about quantum, if you're not thinking about defense technology or energy or clean tech or food tech or all these things which are, and what's going on in the health area, which are changing the world, then you're keeping your eyes closed. There is so much opportunity. Don't be depressed. Don't be discouraged. Move forward, and you can do it.
Jon, this has been a fascinating conversation. I usually end off with a very quick rapid fire round, 3 short questions, 3 hopefully short answers. We're in the summer. We have nice long Shabbos afternoons. What do you like to do at that time?
I like to read books.
Amazing. And speaking of books, do you have a favorite book on the Parsha that you go back to look for inspiration, guidance, or just something interesting?
I like Rabbi Sacks.
Amazing. And finally, if you were forced by gunpoint to leave the startup world, find some new profession, new job, anything in the world that maybe something you dreamed of doing as a kid or something you had a little bit of an itch to try out, what would that be?
I want to be involved in telling Israel's story. I want to help Israel improve its message and its image.
Okay, amazing. Jon, thank you for doing this. We really appreciate it, and wishing you continued good health and atzlach on all of the wonderful thing you're doing. And I'm sure the listeners are going to really love this conversation.
Amen. It was a pleasure.